Kansas is a prime example of such behavior. The attempt to leverage the debt ceiling, thereby putting the nation's economic recovery at risk, as well as risking another recession and increasing unemployment. And also don't forget that before the Supreme Court this year, several provisions of the Voting Rights Act will be reconsidered. After all of those who struggled so long and many died for. And that is the Supreme Court who defined money as speech and corporations as people. And even though America's death rate from gun violence is 20 to 30 times that of other industrialized nations, and even though recent polls confirm strong public support for several gun control measures, there is doubt that the Congress will pass the legislation. Too many give a higher priority to getting reelected than in doing what's best for the nation. I wonder today, where are our Henry Clays? You may remember that Henry Clay was a prominent politician in the 1800s who was told that his stance on being against slavery would probably cause him to lose the presidential election. And his answer was, I would rather be right than president. We don't have enough of those today. While the president is being called a tyrant, some state legislators vowed to pass laws prohibiting federal gun control. Some representatives threatened to impeach the president. A significant cause of these fractures is the growing inequality of wealth in the U.S. The 400 wealthiest Americans have wealth equal to the bottom 150 million Americans. The top 1% takes nearly 25% of the nation's income annually. The top 1% controls 40% of the nation's wealth. The top 1% had their incomes increased by 18% over the past decade, while the middle class had an actual decline in their income. Men with high school degrees saw a 12% decrease over the past 25 years. Perhaps this is a cause for that group's increasing alienation. A recent article says this about this disturbing trend. Economists are not sure how to fully explain the growing inequality in America. Globalization has created a worldwide marketplace, pitting expensive, unskilled workers in America against cheap, unskilled workers overseas. Social changes have played a role. For instance, the decline of unions. The article goes on to say, but one big part of the reason we have so much inequality is that the top 1% wants it that way. The most obvious example includes tax policy, lowering tax rates on capital gains, which is how the rich receives a large portion of their income. And that has given the wealthiest Americans close to a free ride. Much of today's inequality is due to the manipulation of the financial system, enabled by changes in the rules that have been bought and paid for by the financial industry itself, one of its best investments ever. All of this is having a predictable effect of creating alienation. Of all the costs imposed on society by the top 1%, perhaps the greatest is this: the erosion of our sense of identity, in which fair play, equality of opportunity, and sense of community are so important. The House of Representatives attempted to pass legislation in 2011 that would have cut Head Start by 218,000 children and 55,000 teachers and staff. They also attempted to cut Pell Grants and subsidize student loans for higher education. At the same time, they protected the $4 billion oil subsidies and protected farm subsidies. And this occurred even as Exxon, one of the most profitable corporations in the history of the world, was projecting a $37 billion profit for that year. Many states in particular, those with Republican governors and Republican-controlled legislators, took measures which would depress voter turnout and registration in the recent election cycle. Many of the same states continue to oppose the Affordable Health Care Act, which would put their own citizens, the poorest of their citizens, at risk of being denied health care. Juxtapose all of these acts against Dr. King's commitment to social and economic justice. In 1963, Dr. King, in a speech, Social Justice and the Emerging New Age, said this: "All I'm saying is simply this, that all of life is interrelated, that somehow we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." To reiterate, the problems and challenges confronting this country today have been ongoing for the past 40 years or more. They may differ today only in degree. More than 20 years ago, before some of these young men were ever born, I made the following observations in a speech around this time of the year. We're in the midst of rapid change which is occurring at an ever-increasing pace, and too many of us have not, cannot, or will not understand the changed world and the attendant implications. And so we become angry and frustrated, demoralized and fearful. Some of us use this opportunity to advance themselves through demagoguery. Others attack scapegoats. Today, we're in a furious global competition. There are already 4 or 5 formidable challenges, with more on the horizon. In short, this is a very different world. As 5% of the world's population, the world will no longer allow us to consume 25% of the energy. We have moved from the industrial age to the information age, and knowledge has become a major product. Too many of us hunger for a yesteryear, which has come and will gone, which has gone and will not come again. And we're still arming some in the workforce with skills and attitudes for jobs which no longer exist or which will not long exist. The era of low-skill, high-wage jobs has ended. We cannot command that it return. We're angry because the gap between the rich and the poor has widened, and fearful because the middle class is struggling. We demand simple answers for our budget deficits and our trade deficits. We prefer to believe that our standard of living has been eroded by affirmative action, welfare, and illegal aliens. We have yet to face up to the impact of global competition. It is unlikely, as painful as it may be for some, that we will ever again have the standard of living advantage over the rest of the world that we had just a few years ago. Einstein's warning a long time ago is still appropriate. Everything has changed but our ways of thinking. And if these do not change, we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. We must not turn in on ourselves and blame those who already live at the precipice of existence. We must not punish the poor and ignore the voices of the politically weak. Many of our political leaders and business leaders have an astounding capacity to ignore reality. They blindly yield to ideology and myth. We must be guided by the trends and realities already known. Remember, I was saying this 20 years ago. 1 in 3 Americans will be a minority by year 2000. The dramatic increases in the population age in the U.S. will occur in age categories over 75. That's called the middle aging of America. 2/3 of the nation's workers through year 2000 will be women. Nearly 60% of new workers will be minority and or immigrants. Over 14% of all adults in the U.S. and 20% of children under 17 live in poverty. By 2000, 1/3 of all school-age children will live in poverty. By 2000, almost 42% of all public school students will be minority children or other children of poverty.